So good evening. This is Paul. I'm Paul Friedman, the Executive Director at SaferCountry. As you can see by my mask, which is available now, and for anyone interested, we'd be happy to help you get one of these. And of course, all of our panelists tonight will be receiving a mask as a thank you for joining us. At this point, I will take it off so that perhaps you can hear me a little bit better. So welcome to SaferCountry's Police Use of Force Forum. SaferCountry is holding this forum because of our concern about the use of guns in our society, including by the police. Society accepts that force must be used by the police, but improper force sometimes occurs, and egregious cases occur repeatedly against Black people, unfortunately, in our society. Cases such as Tamir Rice, Walter Scott, Philando Castile, Breonna Taylor, and Jordan Blake have received enormous attention. I might add that there was a case today reported of William Green in Prince George's County, and that case resulted in a $20 million settlement by the county. The gentleman who was 43, he was shot 6 times and killed while he was handcuffed and sitting in the front seat of a police vehicle, police unit. So we've got challenges in our country, and this is another example. Now Congress and state legislatures, including Virginia's, are reviewing and are passing new laws to address prevention and accountability. But it's critical that the public understand what's being considered. Among other ideas, our panelists will discuss the court-created law of qualified immunity, as well as whether improved reporting, screening, and/or training would be effective in achieving those goals. SaferCountry, I'll note, is a 501c3 advocacy and educational organization focused on keeping guns out of unsafe hands. Now, of note, our first Zoom forum back on June 25th was on the new Virginia Red Flag Law, also known as the Substantial Risk Protection Order Law. Ironically, or maybe appropriately, both these forums have one thing in common: trust in the police. It takes trust for people to contact the police to seek help under the Red Flag Law. Yet that essential trust is diminished when force is misused by even one officer in a police department. We live on a cutting edge with regard to this issue. Tonight we're honored to have some excellent panelists join us for this forum. And I'm going to read them off and then read a little bit of bio information on each one to start the program. We're fortunate to have Mike Brown, our Alexandria's Chief of Police. We're fortunate to have Sean Casey, a captain in Alexandria's Sheriff's Office. Brad Haywood, the Chief Public Defender in Arlington County. Jay Jones, member of the House of Delegates from Norfolk. And joining us at the end of the program will be Shannon Taylor, Commonwealth's Attorney for Henrico County. I'm going to start with Jay's bio, since he'll be our first speaker. Jay Jones was born in Norfolk and is the grandson of Hillary H. Jones, Jr., an attorney and civil rights pioneer in Norfolk. Jay graduated from the University of Virginia School of Law in 2015 and is now a partner with the law firm of Bischoff Martingale, PC. February 13, 2017, Jay announced his candidacy for the Virginia House of Delegates, running for the same seat his father held from, excuse me one second. Jay was running for the same seat his father held from 1988 to 2002. On June 13, 2017, Jones won a contested Democratic primary to become the Democratic nominee for Virginia's 89th district. Jay was appointed to the House Appropriations Committee at the beginning of the second term and is currently a candidate in the Democratic primary for the 2021 Virginia Attorney General election. So I think since I've gone on quite a bit here, I'm going to reserve the other bios for just prior to the introductions of the other speakers. And let's start with Jay and his thoughts on what's been happening with this issue in Richmond and overall his thoughts on this matter. Thank you. Jay Jones.
Well, thank you, Paul, and good evening to you and all of the other panelists tonight. I know this is an incredible opportunity to have a real robust conversation about an area that is sort of right in the forefront of not just Virginians' minds, but folks across this country. And so, I'm happy to be able to join you and talk a little bit about the things that we have talked about in Richmond and the things that we're almost done with in the midst of this special session. Because we just passed a budget today that funds most of the priorities and initiatives that we had hoped to get done when we started. But I think none of us can ignore the fact that we are in very, very strange times. We are joining each other probably all from our homes or offices, when I think in normal times we would have been in person up in Northern Virginia or somewhere else in Virginia. But I'm just glad to see everybody is safe and happy and healthy. And that we're able to talk about this stuff. And so, I want to start because I think there have been some misconceptions about what these conversations are about. Conversations are not about law enforcement taking tools away from law enforcement to do their job. I think it's more about accountability and transparency. And I will tell you that as we all saw over the course of the spring, the challenges that we have seen in this country, in this state, in this country, sort of rose to the top. And we are prioritizing these issues because we finally saw that there was a challenge. There was a time to make some change and time to sort of rethink how we are sort of using our laws to best affect the outcomes that we want. And I will tell you, since I have gotten to the General Assembly 3 years ago, justice reform has been a big thing in my legislative portfolio. We have always tried to look for ways to find sort of ways to right size our system to bring it into the 21st century. I feel very strongly that we are working under a system that was created several decades ago with different intentions and aims, but now we've changed as a state and as a society, and we need to sort of right size that. And so I want people to understand that the things that we're doing in this special session didn't just pop up. These have been issues that especially the Virginia Legislative Black Caucus have been talking about for generations. My father was the chair of the Legislative Black Caucus in the 90s. And we had a conversation not too long ago about how some of the things that have been coming up in this special session were things that they were advocating for back in 1992, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this isn't anything new, but I think because of the moment that we're in, every American has been forced to reckon with what we see. And so I've been so heartened by the newfound focus on this and the newfound support for some of these policies. And I've been really, really happy about how we've been able to work with law enforcement on a lot of these. And I see my law enforcement folks on here. And so, hey guys, how are you? Good evening. It's good to see you guys. And I will tell you that I come to this from a place where my mother was law enforcement. She was a prosecutor of violent crime for 30 plus years before she became a judge. And so I grew up around police and sheriffs and these folks. And so I have the utmost respect for the job that they do. I know that they're putting themselves out on the line for us each and every day. But that doesn't mean that we can't do a little bit better in making sure that everybody's playing by what I believe are sort of better and tighter rules. And so, I've had a lot of conversations with my police chief down here, Larry Boone, my sheriff, who is a really good friend of mine, Joe Barron. We don't agree on everything, but we can have open and honest and intellectual conversations about some of these policies that we're talking about. And so with that, I think I can launch into some of the things that we are almost done with in Richmond, because then I want to return to qualified immunity, which has been a big thing for me over the last couple of months. But the General Assembly, we are almost done with our special session. The House today passed a budget that includes funding justice reform measures like a civilian review boards. It bans no-knock warrants. It bans chokeholds by law enforcement. We have an expungement provision in there for criminal records that are over 8 years old. There are a lot of things that we think that are really, really important to making Virginia a safer place, to making Virginia a place that's more accountable, and to making a Commonwealth that's stronger, that it works for everybody. To me, I will tell you, I believe very strongly that our justice system still has a long way to go. And what I fear, and I hope is not true, is that people will say, well, you guys did a lot in special session. We don't need to change anything else. But I would strongly, strongly disagree with that. And I would say, from my sort of viewpoint, right, as a Black man in Virginia, which has not been the easiest experience, despite what some people might tell you, is that we have a lot of changes that are still left to talk about and to work through. We are working under a justice system that has been layered upon for centuries that has not necessarily prioritized the safety of certain people. And I think a lot of us need to come to the table and acknowledge that. And that's a big part of, I think, where we start from. So in Richmond, we've been working on these things. We passed the budget that enables a lot of the funding of a lot of this stuff. And the Senate is working on theirs. And I hope that we're done in a couple of weeks, because frankly, I'm having a hard time focusing on my law practice and the campaign and the legislating. And I recently got married, so we had that on the table too. So it's been an interesting pandemic season. But what I will say is that I'm so proud of the work that we've been able to do and the things that we've been able to prioritize. And I think Virginia's been a leader. You know, I'm born and raised here. My family's been here for generations. I'm proud of this state, and I acknowledge the challenges that we've had in its history. But I tell people we have an opportunity to really turn the ship around or redirect our ship, which is in the middle of the ocean. It doesn't happen immediately. It takes time. It takes a lot of work by a lot of people. But I do think that we are going to a place where we're getting to be on the same page. I think that we all can agree that things have not been perfect. But I think the point of what we're doing is to try to become more perfect in our union and in our policing and in our justice system broadly, right? We've given prosecutors discretion to dismiss charges if they want, which I think is a big deal. My mother said, I wish I had that power when I was prosecuting these cases. And then we can talk about qualified immunity, but I don't want to lose sight of the fact that we are making some real positive steps here in Virginia as it relates to justice reform. And one of those steps that I would like to see us take, when we're not there yet, we had some great conversations about it, is removing the defense of qualified and sovereign immunity for cases where people's constitutional rights have been deprived. And so I hope folks know what those mean, but I'll give you a brief primer so I can sort of inform the rest of the discussion. Qualified immunity is a federal defense in federal court that people can use to say, hey, I'm not liable because of the protections that we have under the federal law. It's a judicially created law. Sovereign immunity is what you probably are more familiar with, because cities and localities are able to use that for their employees to say, hey, there is no liability because they're working in the course of their duties as city employees. So they're very similar, but they're not altogether the same. I have seen in my law practice, and I have read and talked to a whole bunch of people about qualified immunity and sovereign immunity, and I'll use them interchangeably because it's probably the easiest thing for folks. And I do think that the doctrine, it has its certain applications where it is absolutely a thing. But we've seen over the course of decades that there have been incidents, and these are unfortunate incidents, and they don't happen all the time, right? I think there's this idea that these incidents happen all the time. They don't. They happen pretty regularly. What we saw in Minnesota and what we saw in Georgia, and you need to be able to get civil redress. And the point of the doctrines is that it prevents victims who have been deprived of their constitutional rights from getting civil in a civil manner. The criminal stuff, if you choose to use your discretion to pursue charges in the unfortunate event of unnecessary force, that's one thing. But you also, I believe, victims should get their redress, their proper rights, if they are constitutionally deprived of their rights. So we had this conversation in the General Assembly. It was certainly something that I think a lot of us were sort of honed in on. It passed the House after a couple of false starts, and it died in the Senate. But I think that there's a robust conversation about how we can best achieve the means to our ends, which I believe is to give an opportunity to hear themselves in court. And I heard some of these arguments from, I'd say, opponents, but also so I get this as much. I said, look, put yourself in a position where you family member and colleague who is brutally beaten by law enforcement. Don't you think you'd be able to get redress through avenue? What if that? And they said, since they passed, they repeal ability to bring this back in January. There's going to be a cap on the personal liability of the law enforcement officer, although I would submit to you that in most cases, the law enforcement officer isn't the person who's going to get sued. It's going to be the locality. Most of the law enforcement folks don't have contracts with the city that say if you get sued, you're on the hook. But if they do, we can work around that. But to me, the doctrine, which has its origins in protecting the Ku Klux Klan from beating the heck out of black people back after the Civil War, is far overdue for a second look. And I think a lot of civil rights organizations, and I'm the ACLU and the Southern Poverty Law Center, these say, look, really big deal for communities of color to have their day in court. And my law enforcement friends have said, and I understand this point, that this is going to lead to a whole bunch of frivolous lawsuits. And I will tell you that I frankly believe that people need to have court. And I want other people to understand as well this misconception that if you take away qualified, a law enforcement officer is not automatically, right, is not going to be found liable by a judge or a jury. You still got to go through the process. And if that law enforcement officer, able and prudent officer in the line of duty would, then they're fine. We're looking at situations where the officer uses excessive force. And I'll use the unfortunate situation of Jacob as an example. I will tell you, as a black guy, I am not dumb enough to walk around a car with a guy who's got a gun drawn on my back to go get a firearm shoot back. Most people just aren't that silly. But I think a lot of officers would agree that if you have a guy in front of you and you're drawn and his hands are up or his hands are here, 7 bullets probably isn't the right course of action. You could probably achieve the disabling in 1, 2, maybe 3. Give your point blank, I'm no great shot, but I could get somebody in disabling from that distance. And I'll tell you, I could feel those bullets back. As a black man in America, those situations are very visceral to me. And although it didn't happen in Virginia, incidents like that do happen. We just happen to see that one on camera. And so part of what we've been doing, aside from the justice reform, is to equip our law enforcement body cameras, because I think that's transparent. I think that holds them accountable. But this is a much larger conversation about how we want people to interact with law enforcement and how we want to hold them responsible. And there was this argument that people said, well, the insurance premiums are going to go up. I'm an attorney. My firm carries insurance in case I screw up. And I'm not perfect. I make mistakes as an attorney, but I don't do it to the point where I commit premiums are pretty low. The data suggests that the premiums would stay low if your department doesn't have a lot of it. So, and I would submit that most jurisdictions in Virginia are full of great cops and are full of great law enforcement officers who don't have these situations. All we want to do is provide redress in the unfortunate event that it happens here. And so that's the conversation we've had around qualified immunity. It is not going away. And Colorado, I think, will serve as a test case, but we are going to come back. We're going to try to refine it. Go get studied by a House and Senate joint subcommittee made up of courts of justice members. Unfortunately, I'm not a member of the courts committee because you can't serve on appropriations and courts at the same time. So I deal with the money side of it. And it came through the appropriation, had a fiscal, and I got to touch it in that capacity. But my colleague, Jeff Bourne, who was one of my best friends, this was his bill and I was the chief co-patron. I was proud of that. And I'm proud of the work we're doing and we're continuing to do, because these conversations are long overdue. And I just want to make sure that everybody has a chance, if their rights are deprived, to be able to have their day in court. And so that was one part. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Paul. I was just saying that was one part of our package, and I'm happy to talk about it more, but I'm the next speaker. So thank you for giving me an opportunity to join you tonight.
Good. Well, stick around, and we'll talk some more. I want to next introduce Mike Brown, Alexandria's Chief of Police since 2017. Prior to that, Michael had nearly 4 decades of experience in law enforcement, safety oversight, and public policy. He rose through the ranks of the California Highway Patrol, as indicated by his backdrop, and starting as a police officer in Los Angeles in 1977, culminating in his appointment as state commissioner from 2004 to 2008. He previously served as chief or assistant chief in various divisions. As commissioner, he led one of the largest law enforcement agencies in the United States, with approximately 7,900 sworn personnel, 3,100 civilian staff, over 100 field offices, and a budget of $1.8 billion. Mike holds a bachelor's degree in criminal justice administration from California State University in Sacramento, a master's degree in criminal justice administration from California State University in Los Angeles, and a master's degree in management from California State Polytechnic University in Pomona. He's also a graduate of the California Peace Officers Standards and Training Command College and the FBI's National Academy and National Executive Institute. So without further ado, thank you for your patience. Mike, please share with us your thoughts on this, on what you've heard and this issue.
Yeah, thank you, Paul and Boyd, for inviting me in. And this is a huge issue. Jay has given a really good synopsis of what we're looking at on a national level. And if I could, I'd just like to kind of think about it from the law enforcement perspective and offer some of the insight that I've heard from other chiefs and even our own officers and officers across the country at times. We take the legitimacy, our legitimacy in the community as a critical factor of our success. If we don't have the legitimacy or the perception that the community feels we're doing the right thing, that affects our ability to do our job. And for the most part, I think Jay made a comment, there's a lot of good cops, and there are. And they've looked at this debate. They've seen what's happened on TV. The killing of George Floyd was huge for us in the profession. Many of us, when we look at these videotapes that we see, or these tapes of conduct and use of force, we're looking at it from a very critical eye. At the same time, the narrative is, and the repetitive nature of it has also had an effect on us as individual professionals and as a community at large, because most cops who do the right thing are looking at themselves, looking at their profession, looking at the seriousness of this and the perception of the public. I will say that there's always a time and a need to modify and upgrade policies, procedures, training, and to do the right thing to stay current. That's what makes us a profession. And when I first came on working in the 70s, it was far different than it is today. Today we have much more refined policies. Our training is more significant. We have other tools, and the demands placed on the officers, while they may be basically the same, are much more significant and nuanced because of the expectations of the community. Use of force is a big issue. There's very few cops that like to enjoy and get engaged in use of force. And the ones that do, usually we have to look at to see why they like it, because it's not fun. Fortunately, as Jay points out, it doesn't happen as often, given the context that we have. In the city of Alexandria alone, last year, we had over 80,000 calls for service. And that doesn't even count the self-initiated activity of the officers on the road. And yet, with all those contacts, we only had 28 uses of force. Now, we investigated each one of them individually because individual investigations are called for, because we look at each officer, and there were more than one officer at the time, but there was only 28 instances where we had a use of force. Now, the problem with that is that we have to look and understand why we're using force. And we're starting to do that as a profession. We're looking at that in the police department, have been for the last couple of years. And we're trying to make sure that we're doing the right training. We have the right policy. For example, some departments are very attuned to what their dialogue has going, and frankly are ahead of the game. Those that have embraced, for example, the 21st century policing episodes have policies in many cases that address all the issues they're discussing in Richmond and capitals across the country. So having said that, there are some agencies that may not be there yet. And so it's right for us to look at what we're doing, making sure it's the right thing, and more importantly, understand what we're doing so that we don't jeopardize the legitimacy that we so desperately need. I will also say, this is a trying time for a lot of the men and women who wear a badge. There's not one, I believe, individual who hasn't had some period of introspection, wondering if they trust me, if it's all worth it. And that's natural given the dialogue that's taken place. I'm very pleased to hear comments like Jay's, which speak to the fact that many of our law enforcement officers are indeed professional, and they do the right thing, and they come out to do the right thing, and they do it day in, day out. In many cases, working long hours, handling very, very tough instances, de-escalating so they don't have to use force, and all those kinds of things that we've tried to teach them so they can get it done properly. But we have work to do, and we'll continue to do that work, because otherwise we can't call ourselves a profession. And it's not easy. But I do enjoy talking about this issue because a lot of people don't understand it, and I like to be able to make sure that we understand what we're doing, how we're doing it, how we investigate this stuff, so we make sure that we're doing it correctly. And I do believe in accountability and transparency, and those are the hallmarks of 21st century policing, which we've embraced in Alexandria and other departments have across the country and across the Commonwealth. We need to always continually improve. So I'm very excited to have this conversation. I don't want to take too much more time. I'd love to chat about with my panelists and also have an opportunity if someone wants to ask some questions. Thank you so much, Paul.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And we will, I'm sure, have some questions. Let me next move to Sean Casey. Sean was recently promoted to captain. He's had a highly distinguished career in the Alexandria Police Department before joining the Sheriff's Office in 2017, where he resides now. Relevant to tonight, Sean organized implicit bias training for all employees to prevent discrimination and ensure an inclusive work environment. And he also implemented a new internal investigations management system. He's active in youth outreach efforts like mentoring and reading the students, and in civic engagement, having organized and launched the Sheriff's Community Academy. He's currently serving as the liaison to business and resident associations in Delray and Cameron Station, and he also co-chairs the Alexandria Democratic Committee Labor Caucus. Sean is also a graduate of the Leadership in Police Organizations program at the International Association of Chiefs of Police. The intensive 3-week curriculum teaches law enforcement professionals how to lead groups, organizations, and efforts for change. A lifelong Alexandrian, Sean is a graduate of T.C. Williams and Virginia Tech, and he and his wife have 2 children, live in the West End of Alexandria, where he serves on the executive board of a local association. Sean, are you out there?
Hey, Paul. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it. This is definitely a great time to have a conversation like the one we're having tonight. You've got some here. Listening to Jay talk was very interesting. Hearing his point of view and his perspective. I think he's got a lot of background knowledge and experience.
Hey, you want me to
very
watch
interesting, obviously.
One moment. Rebecca, can you put your mic on mute?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'll mute you there. Go on, I'm sorry.
Obviously, having worked at the police department for a majority of my public safety career, and some of that with Chief Brown, a lot of experience there, a lot of insight. And having worked with Brad Haywood as well. I was a detective for many years, and Brad was a defense attorney many years. So we saw a lot of each other back in Alexandria courts. Always enjoyed working with Brad, always very challenging. So it was good. So it's a good panel here. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. First of all, I just say I'm speaking on my behalf. I'm not speaking on behalf of the sheriff's office. I'll let the sheriff do that talking. I am here to just lend my experience that I've had in law enforcement, here in Alexandria in particular for the past, 14, 15 years. And also kind of my view of where I sit today at the sheriff's office in the administrative services section when it comes to training. And I think that training is definitely something that we as law enforcement need to improve upon. I think we talk about training. I think we like to say we do a lot of training, but I don't think we do enough training, especially when it comes to use of force situations, de-escalation, cultural diversity, implicit bias. I think a lot of that gets overlooked. I think we do some, just not enough. And I really feel like with all the stuff that I've seen from officers having issues of misconduct, I mean, things that happened in Minnesota, those are just terrible. And that's just a bad apple, 100%. It was wrong. And the thing that was so disturbing about that, on top of George Floyd being murdered, was that you had other officers there who refused to act and take action. So that's a big issue with our profession right now that we have to acknowledge and address, because when someone's committing kind of a gross misconduct, a murder in front of you, you've got to step in. You've got to feel like you can step in. And if you don't feel like you can step in and stop that, well, then something's really, really wrong. And we have to change that. We have to change that. And at the sheriff's office, to do that, we're we recently just were accepted to active bystandership law enforcement training that's done by Georgetown University. That's evidence-based. That's something that started in Louisiana. We're one of 33 law enforcement agencies in the country who was accepted to do that training. And it's all about preparing and training your staff on how they can be active bystanders. So what that means is when they see misconduct happening, when they see bad policy happening, when they see their counterparts doing something they shouldn't, they have the confidence and the ability to step in and stop it. Because if we had that, a lot of these things wouldn't be happening right now. So that's really where I come from. That's my prism, is I really think training is a big, big portion of what we're missing here. We really have to step it up. We have to stop talking about it and start doing it. And I think that really could improve things quicker and faster than we all think if we really start to engage our law enforcement communities and give them the opportunity to do some more real, effective training. So thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Sean, for that opening. Next up is Brad Haywood. And Brad, thank you for joining us. Brad is Chief Public Defender for Arlington County and the City of Falls Church, Virginia. He earned his BA from the University of Michigan and JD from Columbia University Law, where he was the managing editor of the Columbia Human Rights Law Review. Brad began his legal career with the Alexandria Public Defender's Office, perhaps, before entering private practice with a firm that focused primarily on capital defense and other complex felony litigation. He returned to indigent defense to lead the Arlington Public Defender's Office 3 years ago. Brad is also the founder and executive director of Justice Forward Virginia, a leading criminal justice reform advocacy organization in the Commonwealth. And that puts a little onus on you, Brad, perhaps to share your deep understanding and knowledge of this issue, and I hope it'll help stir our conversation this evening. So, Brad, you're up.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me. I appreciate all of the remarks that have already been made tonight. And I've talked with Paul a little bit about my perspective on this, and I know for those of you who are watching live or going to watch the recording, you're probably anticipating a certain take on these issues, since I'm a career defense attorney, a public defender, and a criminal justice reform advocate. But of the things said tonight, the perspective of Chief Brown and Sean Casey and Delegate Jones, you know, everything they said, it sounded great to me. I appreciate that we have law enforcement officials that are doing their jobs very professionally, that care about human life when they see a tragedy like what occurred with George Floyd. I appreciate that we have delegates like Jay Jones who recognize problems and want to find real concrete fixes for them. But that being said, I respect anyone who goes into the field of law enforcement, who goes into any public service field. It's not, for me, this is not about attacking the police. For that reason, I also think that the focus is a little bit misplaced. I think there's been such a focus right now in this moment in history on use of force, honestly, and deaths at the hands of police. And I tell you, I've been a public defender in 2 jurisdictions that have very professional police departments. Not a lot of people die at the hands of the Alexandria police or the Arlington police. There aren't a lot of complaints of excessive force. It doesn't really happen that often. Even if we ended qualified immunity, there just wouldn't be that many lawsuits against Alexandria cops or Arlington cops. But that doesn't mean we don't have a problem. And here's the thing: elected officials take this, put this focus on deaths and use of force, and they think that because Virginia police only kill people once in a while, that we're doing just fine. As long as Black people aren't being killed, then we're all good. I understand why we focus on force. Seeing George Floyd's death was absolutely shocking and tragic. It's painful to watch. It's eye-opening. But like I said, you watch that, and if you haven't been paying attention to the rest of it, you tend to assume that's the problem, that we should just start there and we should end there. Stop the deaths, and like I said, we're all good. But think about it. If people liken this to the civil rights movement, during the civil rights movement? Were people just mad about the murders of Emmett Till and Medgar Evers? Like, if we had just gotten rid of murders of people like them, would everything be just fine? No, of course not, because that wasn't the point. The point wasn't that it wasn't just the deaths. The movement isn't called Black Deaths Matter, it's called Black Lives Matter, and that's for a reason, because it's about the lives. A life is more than the breath in your lungs. A life is more than the beat of your heart. It's your freedom, it's your liberty, it's your family, it's your relationships, it's your community. It's all those things that end the moment that handcuffs are placed on your wrist and you're locked in a cage. Dying is a symptom. It's the most visible symptom. But the fact of the matter is, do we solve this problem? Like, would George Floyd be alive today if Derek Chauvin had simply had more training hours? I think that kind of sets it in stark relief. Is all that guy needed more training? Is that all he needed? I beg to differ. I don't think that any amount of training would have made a difference. I think Derek Chauvin was going to kill George Floyd, whether he'd had 500 hours or 5,000 hours of training. And I think it's because the life of George Floyd was diminished in his eyes. And if someone is thought to be less valuable, less worthy of basic human dignity, then we're gonna see that in actions like that. And that's why the dying really is a problem, because it is evidence of a more fundamental problem that lies at the heart of our justice system. And that's why we see, we don't just see more Black men dying at the hands of police. We see more Black men being arrested for nonsense crimes. We see more Black men in jails and prisons. Right now, we have 1 million Black Americans in jails and prisons. We have another 1.5 million Black Americans on probation or parole. We see these racial disparities from the moment of arrest to incarceration and even through to the death penalty. It's a set of, and it's because of policies that are really baked into the criminal code. For the legislator here, it's 18.2 and 19.2. It's not the sections dealing with public safety and police that are the problem. American policing has been defined by the mission that it was given. And I respect the fact that people like Chief Brown and Sean Casey, they are very professional, and they will do whatever mission that they are given very well. But the fact is, they've been given a mission now that that results in injustice from, like I said, the moment of arrest all the way to the moment a person is incarcerated in a prison. That mission has been for 40 years now to wage a war on drugs. Because of that, it's been to view people of color with distrust, to treat communities of color as a battlefield. And I think through that, the institution of law enforcement has taken on an identity. And the identity, I think sometimes is even subconscious. And you don't start scaling back any of that until you address the components that created it. And here's I'm not going to say I'm disappointed with what's going on in the special session, because I think there's been a lot of progress. But I think that there's been, like I said, the whole point of me talking right now is because I think the focus is slightly misplaced. It's not just that when you talk about chokeholds or use of force standards or body cams, those are all good things, but they're not going to get at the heart of the problem here. We need to stop over-policing minor conduct, like misdemeanor conduct. We need to stop treating addiction as a crime. We need to stop criminalizing mental illness and treating prisons as de facto psychiatric hospitals. We need to give up on the idea that long prison sentences are the only appropriate redress for criminal conduct, and that people cannot change. There is such a reticence right now in the General Assembly, and I know Delegate Jones knows this, and he's observed it himself. There's such a reticence to embracing this new paradigm, that people are capable of change, that we can have a better system. We have 5% of the world's population. We have 25% of the world's prison population, and we have crime rates that are generally much higher than the rest of the developed world. What we're doing isn't working, so why do we still do it? So it's a hard fix, and I think we want to find the easy fix. We want to find the fix that everyone's comfortable with, whether it's a suburban lawmaker, whether it's a chief of police, whether it's leaders of nonprofits. We want to find the easy fix that everybody can rally around. But I think the fixes that need to happen are ones that some people are a little bit uncomfortable with. That challenge our notions of how this is supposed to work, the things that we've come to accept as what's going to be effective. And actually, I don't think this is beyond reach. It's just that our leaders need to open that dialogue. I have personally talked to a number of Arlington police who, you get them in a public setting where maybe they get defensive about some of this, but if you get them in a private conversation, they don't want to be put in situations like Chief Brown said, where they have to use force. Like, nobody likes that. Nobody goes to work thinking they want to shoot somebody. And frankly, they don't go to work wanting to be social workers either. I know very few police officers that want to, treat someone's schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, or, deal with somebody who's, not taking care of their hygiene, or somebody who's just so, dead drunk, that everything from the moment you contact them is going to be messy. Nobody wants to do that. Even police want a better paradigm. So why don't we start having that dialogue? And why don't we start doing that? Why don't we start talking about the flaws in our justice system more generally? Because that's where it's coming from. It's not about how gentle police are. It's not how polite they are. It's not about giving them 500 more training hours. People talk about Minnesota a lot because that's where George Floyd died. Well, you know what? Minnesota requires, I think, more than double the training hours for every licensed law enforcement officer in the state than Virginia does. And it still happened there. They have in Minneapolis 3, not 1, but 3 civilian oversight bodies. And Derek Chauvin still killed George Floyd by putting his knee on his neck. So the solutions aren't just with these point of arrest, use of force policies. It's you got to get more fundamental. We got to get to the heart of the problem. What is the mission that we've given law enforcement? What are we doing with our criminal justice system? And why do we rely so much on police and prisons to solve our social problems? It's a lot of work, but it's got to be done. And so, I told you I'd go a little off script here, and I did. I apologize, but hopefully my my comments were enlightening to some extent.
No, excellent. We thank you for your insights and your feelings. I know Mike has some thoughts about that. Please share your thoughts. Mike, would you turn your microphone on, please?
Brad, I want to thank you for those comments because I happen to agree with you. I've seen the evolution of the calls and the clients that we work with, and over the years, I've seen more and more interesting things given to policing. Mental health is an example. We've heard the conversation about that. Many of our calls in Alexandria and across the country are related to mental health issues. Putting somebody into a jail is not going to give them the intervention, the treatment, so that they can avoid that kind of conduct in the future. But when we get the call, it's a crisis moment. And so we're putting these officers in a very difficult situation. Some of our laws were designed to protect people, but they actually create situations where the officers don't have opportunities for diversion or using some other means besides taking them to Sean's jail. There are some people that belong in jail. There are some people that, frankly, probably are very evil. But more often than not, we're dealing with people who have mental health issues, substance abuse issues, coping skill issues that they haven't learned, maybe developmental issues that are related to the opportunities that they were given as they grew up or currently have. And cops can't fix that. We're not designed for that. They need to get treatment from professionals and others so that we don't have these kinds of issues. The things we're talking about today are important. I'm not trying to divert from those, but those are specific outcomes resulting in many cases from an engagement, which in many cases is a call for service given to that cop. And so I think we need to kind of look at it holistically down the road, because we can address all these issues and we can give people more training, and there's a lot of it out there that's available. But it doesn't stem that issue about opportunity and equity in terms of our criminal justice system. And I really do believe personally that we need to do a better job at that. And we need to give the officers, set up the programs and the capacity to do the diversion and get people into the treatment that will help them the best so that they can carry on and increase their net worth in life and their value that they see in their life. But unfortunately, we don't have that capacity. And so many of our calls that we get are directly related to things where the officer is just trying to establish the peace and then deal with the whatever discretion they may have to mitigate that. And oftentimes the only thing left for the officer or their actual legal instruction that they get is they have to take that person to jail, especially for low-level crimes. And I don't think you'll find many chiefs or even labor union people say differently on that in the law enforcement arena.
Right. So let me just take a moment to talk about the training versus screening, because what we've seen in a lot of situations, whether it's Tamir Rice or even the case involving Prince George's County that was in the news today, often the officers involved have a history of problems. And those problems were not addressed, they were not observed sometimes. I know that in Richmond, we're trying to make our police departments more aware of who they have and who they might be hiring. This seems to be a critical problem across the board in many places. Perhaps we couldn't have trained the problem in Minnesota out, but we might have screened the problem out. Jay, would you address what you've been doing down in Richmond on this subject?
Yeah, I mean, we want to make sure that, one, if you're being disciplined as a law enforcement officer, if you go somewhere else, that jurisdiction is aware, right? We don't want bad actors to hop from place to place. I think, Sean and Mike will agree with you on that, right? They don't want, if they have full information, they're not going to hire someone who's had challenges before. And it's made it easier to do that. We also want to make sure that we're holding people accountable, right? To me, accountability and transparency is the key to anything. And so, yes, we have people who need to be disciplined who have had issues. But I agree with Brad when we talk about it can't just be the downstream stuff that we focus on, right? It's got to be the midstream and the upstream, right? And the upstream is the code, and the midstream is, I would call it the people, right? That's where you talk about mental health. That's where you talk about addiction. That's where you talk about those things. And we do a terrible job of doing things on those first two. And I'm not going to call my colleagues to task, because if I was presented with bills that would change the way that we sentence people and change the way that we push people and how we're treating them, I would be a yes vote every single time. But we also can't forget that this is Virginia. Things move slowly, right? It's a place that has never been known for being, a leader in the vanguard on this, right? Mentality where we want to lock people away. And it has an incredible impact on you for the rest of your life. I sponsored a bill a couple of years ago that, and Brad knows, depending on the judge you get, certain crimes can be a felony or a misdemeanor, right? They can be wobblers. And if you have a felony, it makes it incredibly hard to get a job on the back end, because you need occupational licenses in Virginia for just about everything. And if you have a felony, you are prevented from doing like 80 to 85% of the things that require an occupational license, period, full stop. And so we don't focus as much on that kind of stuff, right? What are we classifying as a felony or a misdemeanor, right? How are we approaching that on the back end? And how are we reforming our system that's going to take us out of a sort of a punishment? Because again, Mike and Sean are really just doing what we're asking them to do, which is following the law, which they do all the time. And so we do a crappy job of that. I'll be quite frank with you. And I would use the special session as a way to be instructive on where we are, because it wasn't like all the things that we were doing passed with all the Democratic votes, right? Or with any Republican votes. It wasn't like it was this easy lift. There are still a lot of people who have this idea that being tough on crime is the right thing to do, or they are probably not ready to face the music that being soft on crime, which is how it would be characterized, isn't fatal to your electoral success, because you're going to have an impact on a lot of people. And I will tell you, I would give up my seat in a heartbeat if it meant that I got to vote on those things and people voted me out. I'd be okay with that all day long. But we have this idea, this mentality that to let people out of jail isn't the right thing to do. I mean, we had a devil of a time getting this compassionate release bill through, right? So people who are within 12 months of dying, a Department of Corrections officer, Department of Corrections doctor says this person's going to die within a year, and a doctor on the outside says that this person's going to die within a year, and that way you can leave prison so that you can go be with your family before you pass away and expire. That wasn't even close to being a unanimous bill. And so we are still in this age, I would say, of this 80s, 90s police mentality from a legislative standpoint, right? And I say that not at Mike and Sean, but we as legislators, and I'll put myself in there too, because I'm part of this body and I can't change everybody's mind overnight, but have this fear of making real change to the code, because you will be seen and tagged as soft on crime, and people will say that you want to let all these criminals out of jail, right? In the sweeping characterization of criminals, when we know that not every criminal is the same. There are people who do terrible things, and we can all agree that they need to go and be in jail and get the sentence they deserve. There are a lot of people who make mistakes, and that mistake stays with them forever, and it's forever in the penitentiary, or it's forever from an employment standpoint, forever in that you can't vote, forever. I mean, there's a lot of things that we do to people that make their lives tough on the back end, and we can do better. And I would love to see us do that, but I come into this eyes wide open, knowing the legislature that I serve in and knowing my colleagues. Not everybody is as liberal, right, or as sort of, I would say, forward thinking as folks from Norfolk are, right? I've got to go convince 50 other people in my chamber and 21 on the other side that that's how it works. And so that's the tough part about it. And that Brad's talking about is in practice, right? We should be able to do that, but there are differences from Alexandria to Norfolk to Galax that we can't ignore, right? You have to take that into account. And so none of this is going to be particularly easy.
Yeah, can I just chime in real quick?
Please.
Yeah, just to highlight what Delegate Jones was saying, I know how difficult it was to get, how difficult it has been to get that compassionate release bill through. And it's now been, whittled away so much that if it is passed, I would actually be surprised if one person is released each year, like under the new bill. It just, that's
the number shrank and shrank. And again, what I saw on social media, right, when we voted on this stuff, because I voted on it in appropriations, people will say, you're letting murderers and rapists and robbers out of prison, which isn't, those people aren't eligible. And so, I say this on the floor a lot, and I say it to my colleagues, and I say it to my friends, and I say it to my family, and I say it on the stump. We as people, and then I do have to leave, so I'm going to leave you guys with this. So it's been great to be with you guys, but we as people are so conditioned to look and feel what is immediately in front of us, right? We care about my paycheck, my car, my children, their schools, those things. And we rarely take a step back and look at the whole picture, right? And see the whole board. We rarely take the time to think about how it might be to walk in somebody else's shoes and how these things might affect their lives. It is never lost on me that when I'm voting in the House of Delegates, I represent 80,000 people in the city of Norfolk, but everything I do impacts 8.5 million people across the state. And I think we as legislators oftentimes, and I'll put myself in this too, I'm not innocent, fail to take into account the views of a lot of other people and think about how these particular policies might impact others. And it takes advocates like Brad, it takes good law enforcement officers like Mike and Sean to have these open and honest conversations, because without stuff like this, nothing changes. And so I hope that people will take away from these conversations that, yeah, I've got to think differently. I've got to step outside of my comfort zone. I've got to go figure out how we can make this change, knowing all of the obstacles that come along with it, but not being so comfortable to stay in our own little shell, because that's how stuff like George Floyd happens. That's how stuff like this, sort of watered down compassionate release bill happens. We can do better. We just have to demand more of ourselves. So unfortunately, I do have to jump to another engagement, but it's been great to see you guys. It's been great to chat. I can't wait to do it again. Paul, thank you for the invitation. You guys be blessed. Okay. Take care.
Thank you so much, Jay. Mike, let me jump back to you and just hear your thoughts on what they had to say there.
Well, like I said, I can't agree with it more. And I'll give credit to the Commonwealth. We're looking at the issues like other states are. But what Jay described in the Commonwealth is not unique to the Commonwealth. We have states that are also having the same kind of challenges. And a good part of that, the underlying theme in a lot of this reform on a larger scale, is quite frankly not just changing attitudes, but having the courage to find the money to pay for it. The mental health thing isn't a good example. Just here in the Commonwealth, we have a shortage of bed space for people to get treatment. We have officers and deputies all over the Commonwealth moving a human being in crisis to a different treatment center in another part of the state. That involves investment. getting people to even a co-responder approach. We are developing one here in the city, which we've been talking about, where we take somebody who's a psychologist from the Department of Community and Human Services to roll out on calls like us. There's a variety of different models. But then we get down to, we have to put somebody into some kind of protective custody and get them into treatment. Where do we take them? You know, how do we give that person access to the care they need? That's just one illustration. I could talk about substance abuse the same way. And
Are you, Mike, working with fellow chiefs of police around the state who are amenable to your point of view to help the legislators so that they can avoid being charged with being soft on crime to achieve these goals?
yeah, we've talked a lot about diversion. We've talked a lot about these very same issues that Virginia chiefs and the like. A lot of the law enforcement agencies are experiencing the same thing that I'm speaking to. The sheriffs that in the jails, they will talk about the custody, and I'll let Sean cover it, but they have mental health issues in their jail, and they have to deal with those individuals. They probably could be better treated somewhere else, depending upon the nature of the crime that's involved, that's charged for. But we talk about diversion, and very few law enforcement officers would be diametrically opposed to diversion for most of the people they run into. There are some people that are bad actors, and those people do belong in jail. But a lot of the ones, especially the low-level crimes, those are things where you could do some kind of diversion to deal with their individual issue so they don't recidivate or go in a different direction that might be counterproductive to the public safety of the community. I do agree with one thing strongly that Jay did mention, that we all have a tendency, it's a natural tendency, to look at the world around us from our own front yard. And we sometimes don't see what happens to other people. But a lot of our public servants, whether they're deputies in the jails or police officers or defense attorneys or prosecutors, they see a different side of their community. And I think they would like to have some way of dealing with that a little more effectively so we can increase public safety in the long run. But it's a struggle because, again, most people don't see that. They don't see and witness those challenges and those people in crisis. And we need to kind of adjust the laws to allow for that. And
Let me just throw one tough question at you, Mike, if I may. Dave brought up the drug war. And I think it's safe to say that if we were not still in a drug war that we have, society has largely admitted we've lost a long time ago, the Breonna Taylor story might not have never have taken place. And many other crimes on both sides of the coin, whether it's actions by the police in context of trying to enforce that law, that drug war, or on the other side of the coin. Some of the gang wars that are going on and the violence that we hope as a safer country, as a nonprofit on gun violence prevention, we'd love to see it end the kind of gang wars in our society that lead to so many deaths from guns. And do you see a possibility of change there, Mike? And Sean, if you want to offer your thoughts on that personally, or are we stuck in this for a long time to come still?
well, Jay's point is well taken. When I first came into the business, we were doing the drug war in the 70s. And the whole thing was interdiction. And we've spent a lot of time, energy, and focus on that. We were told what to do. That's what we did. None of us really liked it, and we didn't have a lot of discretion when we saw somebody with a Schedule 1 thing. They're going in for a felony. We were taking people to jail for minor possession of marijuana in the 70s. In the 80s, especially when the gang war started taking place over turf and the economy of drugs, we were in that too. And then in the 90s, we continued with it, with the war on crime and gangs and everything else. So there's at least in my lifetime, a 4-decade history of doing this stuff. And, you know, there are some bad actors in gangs. There are some bad people in gangs that belong in jail. But a lot of that, there was some collateral damage in doing some of that enforcement involving people that were just made a bad choice. And maybe it was because they were high, stoned, drunk, or had some other emotional issues. That said, I do think that it can be changed, but it won't be easy. It's over in the culture of law enforcement, and more importantly, I think the culture of the criminal justice system, and I'll let Brad comment on that. But I think we we've ingrained this so much into our system that we think we still have to have the next war. In our profession, in law enforcement, things are cyclical. We have shootings and killings, some gang related, some, just wanton use of street guns across this country. And it's going to come up and it's going to go down, and we have to deal with it. But the treatment, the equity, the opportunity for having a good life and the opportunity for restoration come from the system, or should come from the system. And that's what Jay was talking about. I think that's what you're talking about, Brad. And that's kind of where I'm going, because otherwise we're treating the symptomology rather than trying to deal with mitigating the cause for most things. That's my 2 cents. I'll let Sean chime in if he wants.
No, I agree 100% with you, Chief Brown. Also, I agree a lot with what Jay was saying, is that, the war on drugs is another example of how law enforcement's put in a box. And it's like you have to go out and enforce these certain things because that's the box that the legislature or the politicians or whoever made the decision, that's what you're going to enforce. War on drugs hasn't worked. We all know that. Diversion needs to happen. People need to have different options. Law enforcement needs to have different tools to help deal with folks who are suffering from addiction, as opposed to just arresting them and locking them up. But at the same token, myself and Chief Brown and, I'm sure even Brad to a certain degree has seen folks and the damages that drugs can do to people when, and those damages come when not having the right treatment and the ability to get people the help they need. And that's a big missing part right now of law enforcement, having those tools to deal with that. And I think, Paul, you make a great point about the Breonna Taylor situation, because there's, does that even happen if we're doing that, if we have that war on drugs and it's there's a lot to be said for it. And I think we got to try something different, and we got to be seriously committed to it as well.
Brad, you want to throw a thought in on that?
Sure. I find Sean and Mike's comments really refreshing. Actually, it's nice to talk to you all. When the way you talk about it's funny. I do a lot of criminal justice reform advocacy work, and I think I've said the word defunding maybe 3 times since June. I just think it's a terrible word for what it means. Like, when you have to explain what you mean, and what you actually mean is the exact opposite of what it sounds like. It's like, you should probably just not use that word. But like, all it really refers to is, not relying on police and prisons to solve your social problems. So, who disagrees with that? Like, if there's a better way to make the community safe, where you don't need somebody with a badge and a gun to do it, and you can do it through a treatment program or social work or, public benefits or whatever, like, I don't think anyone disagrees with that approach. Like, you just want to find effective, evidence-informed strategies for reducing crime in your communities. And that's really all that movement is about. It becomes politicized in part because of the movement itself. And they chose such bad messaging. But that's why I don't talk about it. I just talk about the rest of the stuff. It's like, if you as law enforcement agree that you should have the option of somebody who's, just had an overdose, maybe they had some heroin on them or something, you should be able to take them to a detox facility instead of taking them to jail. Like, wouldn't that be great? Actually, and get them at a moment in their crisis where they can make a decision about going into rehabilitation. This is going to be the last time I use, or whatever. Having those options available. Like in Arlington right now, Arlington spends a ton of money actually on their Department of Human Services. And by and large, I think they have a lot of good services. But even in a county as progressive as ours that spends as much money as they do on, mental health services and substance abuse treatment, they don't have a single county operated and funded long-term residential drug treatment facility. They don't have one. I tell you what, every Friday when I'm in front of our circuit court judges with people who violated probation, I think probably if I have 5 clients, for 2 or 3 of them, I'm asking for a long-term residential treatment option. And the only one we've got in Arlington is in the jail. So, I tell you, if you just funded that program, that is, I mean, social science shows us, fund the program, you're going to have less recidivism. So, like, why don't we do that? And I think it's, maybe the more we have these conversations, the more we all kind of understand the better approach. But this is a good dialogue, so I appreciate everyone's input.
Paul, if I could respond briefly, Brad's spot on about the language. Sometimes we lose the issue in the language that we choose. For example, the defund the police became a comment that was associated with all the negative consequence and focus on the police. And the police automatically said, I'm doing so bad, you're going to take my budget. If you were to reframe that and say that, look, we're trying to address the problem. So we're going to look at ways that we can reduce the calls for service, reduce the exposure, reduce the potential impact incidents of use of force or something like that, and reduce the possibility that I'm going to see Mike Brown every Friday night in a condition that's going to require me to take him to Sean's jail, then yeah, I think you would have better discourse and maybe some real good discussion about potential solutions to end recidivism and address the issue. But we get caught up in this rhetoric sometimes, and and I've been making a point for a number of months now that words do matter. And we have to be careful of how we frame these. Otherwise, we will lose the opportunity to address the real serious issues that can make a difference, because we get caught up in defensiveness or accusations, and we treat little things rather than the big things, which really gets down to equity and opportunity. And there's a lot of very well-meaning people in Arlington that Brad pointed out. We have the same thing in our DCHS. They've got, for a city our size, we've got some incredibly robust programs. Problem is, we've got probably more candidates for participation in the programs than we have the ability to handle them. And so if you solve those problems on the front end, you'll meet your capacity needs. But there's other parts of the Commonwealth and indeed the country that don't even have what we have in this general area.
Thank you. I want to take this moment to welcome Shannon Taylor to our program. Shannon, if you'll let me introduce you, and then you can bring your mic on board. Shannon was born and raised in Albemarle County, where she attended public schools. She graduated from Albemarle High School and received her undergraduate degree from the University of Virginia and law degree from the University of Richmond. Shannon has over 2 decades of professional experience in state and federal courts, as well as years working with state agencies and the General Assembly to help shape more progressive criminal justice policy. From 2008 until 2011, Shannon was a defense attorney at Boone, Beal, and Richmond. She left to run successfully to be Henrico County Commonwealth's attorney, and she has served since 2012. She's now in her 3rd term, and we are very pleased to have her here. We've already heard, Shannon, I'll bring you up to date here. We've heard from our other panelists. They've given us sort of a broad brush of their feelings about the use of force and whether that really even is the fundamental issue that we should be thinking about. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. And I might add that, we talked a bit about the Breonna Taylor situation. SaferCountry actually reached out to the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office in Kentucky, in Jefferson County, to find out whether they might want to pick that case back up now that the Attorney General has declared that self-defense was the reason they could not go forward. And yet the person who shot the officer they based the self-defense argument on was not the one killed. It was the young woman who did not have a gun. And she did not shoot anyone. And so it presents a very interesting case for us to think about. I'd love to hear your thoughts as to whether you think the Commonwealth's attorney there should consider going back and picking that case up again, or some other independent prosecutor might want to do that, what you think of that particular aspect. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about use of force in general. So the floor is now yours, Shannon.
Well, thank you. I will tell you the reason why I'm late is because I participated on a national PAL Zoom call with young people who were asking myself, our new police chief, Eric English in Henrico, and our county manager these exact questions about criminal justice reform and police reform and social justice issues. So I regret that with everything else I've got going on, I've not dived into the Breonna Taylor situation the way that I'd like to be educated to speak specifically to your question. But I can say this. We've got this whole movement now where, we had Wisconsin, we didn't trust our DA, so we went to our governor, who went to our attorney general. Now we've got Kentucky, who has the attorney general, and now we don't trust what the AG has done, so now we want to go to our local prosecutor. And somewhere we've got to figure out what is the right way to do this. And because I have been saying that along with the police reform comes the question of prosecutorial accountability. So while we're talking about police reform, we're talking about training, we're talking about mental health issues. The next question is looking to the prosecutors and saying, so what are you doing to help build the trust, for the community that the system actually is equitable and the system is actually fair. So, use of force is something that is an aspect that not only are we talking about law enforcement who will get the training in it themselves, but it's something that, prosecutors need to be educated on it as well. And we shouldn't just be getting educated just when there's a police shooting that happens in our jurisdiction, which is 99% of the time what's happening. And that doesn't mean that that what we've been doing is so wrong all this time, but it does mean that we have to have a better understanding of what the training is that law enforcement is going through. And we have to ask the tough questions to make sure that training that they are receiving is even the correct training. And I see Chief Brown he was nodding his head, and I did hear his comments about what does that law enforcement training look like, and what can we do to keep our men and women on the street who are, public safety officers up to date with the best practices to keep the community safe, keep them safe, keep the community safe, keep the citizens safe. So I think the one aspect of the Breonna Taylor case that I do think is very confusing, and so it's also hard for us to Monday morning quarterback, particularly now that we're being told that there are things that have not been shared, and we're all trying to say who got it right or who got it wrong. I think it is very confusing to the public to know that you had these officers go into this home that, whether it's 2 or 3 shots fired from this gun, 5 to 6, shots fired from this gun. But if you hit a person, it's going to be okay. But if you don't hit a person and your shots went, a particular direction, then it's not okay. Like that idea, that premise that you're talking about the same environment and one officer's conduct is okay, but the other officer's conduct is not, I think is trying to figure out what the law is in Kentucky, trying to understand, was this, again, when we're talking about building trust and in the system, was that just the AG's way of trying to pacify people by saying, but hey, look, we got some type of charge out of here. People don't want to hear that. People don't want to say, don't pacify us. People want the truth. People want, the players in the system to do their job the right way, to do their job ethically, and be transparent and accountable. And so I regret that if there is any truth to this statement from this grand juror who's saying, hey, what this attorney general is saying is not true, that is not helping the system. That attorney general is not helping prosecutors like me who are trying to do the right thing and trying to be part of the reform and trying to be accountable to the community. So, use of force, I went and did, there was a thing called Force Science. That is one of many, I'm going to call it a school because I was in Quantico for a week, but one of many programs that I know that Chief Brown's familiar with. And it's still this idea that we need to know exactly what the training is. We need to know our department's manuals and policies. It really would be a good thing to continue to have good dialogue, which, my previous chiefs have sometimes submitted policies to us. asking for the Commonwealth Attorney's review of a policy. Is there something there that we think is lacking, particularly when we're talking about policies involving officer, use of force? This new chief that we have, I just got to give him a shout out, because Chief English just got on this call with these young people talking about changes that he's going to make to procedures and protocol in Henrico. To talk about, is it a response to resistance or is it a use of force? The community would say, that's use of force, not resistance. And don't call it resistance if it's something that you created. So we are making good changes. We're trying to be honest. We're trying to be frank with the citizens. And that's why I think this dialogue during the special session is so important. Now, I also want to say that with the caveat that while I know that we want reform and we want it now, we got to make sure that we're doing things right, because you don't want to rush and make some type of change and then realize, 9 months from now that you've done it wrong and you're already past your General Assembly cycle and you're stuck with some type of protocol for 12 months and you need to revisit it. But I am, as part of my VPBJ group of progressive prosecutors, we are definitely committed to be part of that dialogue with our members of General Assembly, particularly, Senator Surville, and will continue to be part of that dialogue.
Outstanding. Well, thank you for presenting that. I think, one of the issues that circulates here is the need for publicity, the need for outreach to the community at large. And whether it deals with new red flag law that we discussed in our previous Zoom back on June 25th that requires people to come forward to reach out to the police, which is a big ask in a day when trust is so precious to be found. And of course, we all know that this dialogue, we hope this kind of dialogue will be multiplied, because dialogue and transparency are the keys to that, building that trust. But building that trust is what's needed, and part of that is putting out the word to people that they can reach out, and also that changes are being made when changes are made. So the kind of change you're talking about, Shannon, about how the police interact with people on a day-to-day basis, that's what it sounded like to me. That sounds like something that needs to be highlighted to people so they can see that the outrage on the street in America is resulting in some difference, in some way that's going to change their future. Mike, have you experienced that in Alexandria? And have you looked at the way we're treating people in the city and changed anything as a result of what we've seen in the last year?
Well, this department's been doing a lot of outreach in the city and setting up networks for a long time. We have 107 civic associations in our 15 square miles that we work with, and everyone's got a liaison. But you can't stop there. And you have to be able to have frank discussions about difficult issues at times. And Lord knows we've been doing an awful lot of that since the killing of George Floyd. I would also say it takes more than just a skill set to listen, but it also takes you have to create the right environment where people can talk about these issues. It's very difficult to do on this Zoom setting or a Teams meeting. And so we're doing micro listening sessions, and it's difficult to set up in the COVID environment, but you can't wait for that. You have to have a chance so that people can feel like they can speak. And let me also say, I agree with what Shannon's saying again. Also, my biggest fear, though, is people have to have the safe space to have that conversation. They have to feel that they can speak their mind about issues, how they feel and where they want to go, and still feel that they're going to, that their comments will matter and that people will be listening. And I got to tell you, there are times where we move slow in our process and we move slow in government, and people will call me and call the police department, "Words are cheap, show me." And they're absolutely right. We have to demonstrate progress. And sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's more difficult, but you got to keep pressing on, and you can't give up. And that's the hard part. Now, there's no easy fix to this. My biggest fear on this is right after we were doing the multiple demonstrations in our city. There were a lot of community leaders that showed up, and I told them all the same thing. I said, I've been doing this. It'll actually be on October 1. I've been hanging around cops for 45 years. I have dealt with this in California. I did the Rodney King thing. I did the East LA riot thing in the 70s. I can go on and on. But we always talk about it, and we always go after the low-hanging fruit. And then the issue dies, and it never gets fixed. Now's the time to fix it. Not just for the cops, not just because Mike Brown thinks it'd be a great idea. We all as a community have to say we want to work together to fix this thing, make it right for everybody, and see if we can solve this problem and do a different paradigm. Because it's just awkward to keep doing the same thing. That's the definition of stupidity when it doesn't work.
Shannon?
And I was going to say a really easy response to that is data that is shareable with the public. Having police information on their website. I mean, even the young person called me out. Miss Taylor, what are you doing about this? And we have a case management system that we are still working on. But, you know, a citizen asked me just last week. She asked me these very specific questions. I went to our IT person and said, this needs to be, you know, produced and dump it into a chart that it makes sense. And it needs to be broken down by race. It needs to be broken down by gender. And to the extent that we can actually do magisterial district, we need to do that too. And, you know, and that was my word of when I do that, it is going to be on our website. And that goes right to what Chief Brown's saying, which is, you know, you're not just, you know, talking the talk, you're walking the walk. You're making this information available to the public to show them that you are committed to the change.
And the other thing about the data, though, we've been putting data out there and increasing numbers for the last 3 years. It's all part of our 21st century policing project. That gets you get bit sometimes on that because I'll call you on what's that data mean. But an example of that is we put our arrest data out this year. And as one would expect, it was disproportionate towards African Americans and Latinos. So we could just sit there, our data's out, it's all good, touchdown, let's move on to the next play. But that's not how it works. You have to understand what that data represents and see if there's issues in there. And I'll give you an example of one. Our arrest data, when we looked at it, we found that there was a really big driver, and that was some corporate policies on petite larceny. And so we had a conversation with those companies saying, are you aware that your data in disproportionate arrests is in our data? And they had not even thought about that. And so they're looking at their policies to see if there's something that they're doing that's generating this disproportionality. So you got to look at the data, but you got to understand what it means. And that requires a fundamental shift in policing, which has taken place over the last 10 years, where we are bringing analysis in to look at our data, looking at factors that contribute to why we have what we have. We own the data. We're not saying it's not ours, but we need to understand why it takes place. And in those data, well, there will be factors, I guarantee you, that are of a social economic nature that the policing field can't fix. And those are going to be things that need to be addressed by the community at large.
Can I hop in here?
Please.
Chief Brown was talking about it. He's been around 45 years. I haven't been around quite that long. I've been around 17 years, though, doing criminal defense work. And I've been paying attention to this stuff my whole life. And I couldn't agree more. This isn't the first time the world has had these conversations. You know, they had these conversations after Rodney King, after Abner Louima, after Philando Castile, Tamir Rice, and after George Floyd. You know, like, why doesn't it stick? And why don't we start talking about big fixes? You know, because it's always this stuff. It's always like bad apples, training, yada, yada, yada. And we never really get to like, how do we want this to be different? And how do communities want it to be different? And actually, so I think that there is something very promising right now in this special session actually has been the bill on civilian oversight, civilian review boards. So, you know, I think the tendency, as we've talked about, is if you're not directly affected by something, you tend not to be informed about it. You don't remain engaged. So we were all directly affected when George Floyd died, because we all saw the video. We're all hurt by it. our friends are hurt by it. We want to react. But then, you get the emotion out of your body and you're like, what's next? I haven't seen anybody die on TV recently. And then you sort of forget about it. You go on to the rest of your life. There are people who can't do that. There are people who live in, affected communities, over policed communities, just, high crime communities, and they can't. And there are people who are, law enforcement professionals, legal professionals. We deal with this stuff on a daily basis. But the people who are, the whole community, I think, needs input on it. And I think that and they need to be informed about it. And that's why I think the civilian oversight bodies offer so much promise, because you do then have a group of individuals that come from the community that are helping the police do their job in a way that responds to the values and the interests of that community. And that, it doesn't have to be adversarial. It doesn't have to be acrimonious. It can be a collaborative process, and it should be a collaborative process. And you should be getting to the point where, your police are doing the job that the community wants them to do. There should absolutely always be community input into how their neighborhoods are being policed. The community should never be looked at as a battlefield or as the enemy or anything like that. And by the way, I think when you have that dialogue between law enforcement and prosecutors and communities, then also these larger paradigm shifts become more viable, because they aren't being proposed by politicians. It's not being, polluted by all this, rhetoric, public discourse, people deliberately misunderstanding each other, or whatever. Then it's just like, we don't want you to engage in pretextual policing. We don't want you to be, cracking down on driving while black, as they say, or, engaging in broken windows policing. We want you, if you're community police, we don't just want you to be living in our neighborhood. We want you actually to be enforcing the crimes that we think are important, and, talking to us, getting to know us, that whatever it is, whatever it is that I think that is going to make the situation better. I think it's best if it happens at the community level, and that, like I said, I think it helps communities remain engaged, informed, and it holds a great deal of promise for police reform moving forward. That makes everybody happy. Not police departments want to have policies and procedures that keep them from getting in trouble with excessive force cases or whatever. And then reformers like me, we just want sort of like a more, I think, evidence-informed, humane, community-based approach. So like I said, I think it's really something promising that more people ought to be paying attention to.
I want to thank you, Brad. I want to thank Mike. Have a quick comment?
Real quick comment. The National Association of Law Enforcement Oversight has an implementation guide that speaks to what Brad is talking about in terms of community review boards. Most law enforcement agencies, if are doing the right thing, are not going to have a problem with oversight. I don't have a problem with oversight. I would like it to be legitimized to the extent that it looks not just at the cops' behavior, but look for opportunities in the criminal justice systems to address the issues that may manifest themselves in the interactions with the police. And that's one of the ultimate goals of success if you're going to go with a CRB. But I think they do add value if they're constructed the right way for the local community. And again, I didn't want to take us over, Paul.
Oh, that's all right. And, in Alexandria, we're developing just such an overview committee. It's something that you're involved in, I'm sure. And it'll be interesting to see if we can't use past examples and combine them with your insights and the insights of our city council and others to do something unique here that's different, that's going to be more effective than what's been used perhaps in other localities in the past. We'd love to be on the cutting edge of what's right and then, spread the word that we're getting it done correctly. I can't thank you enough, all of you, Sean, Brad, Mike, and Shannon, for joining us. I know it was a little late, Shannon, but still, we got a lot out of you. We got a lot of value out of you. We appreciate your joining us. And we want to also extend our thanks again to Jay, who had to leave a little early, Jay Jones. But all of you were excellent. And, bringing together legislators, the police, the sheriff's office, the defense counsel, and our Commonwealth's attorney is a unique opportunity to get insight and to share ideas. I hope we can do this again. And I was really pleased by the outcome tonight. And I hope you all will be when you see this fully on the recording. In the meantime, let me just say that on behalf of Safer Country, and I'll put my mask on for a moment here. Uh, we thank you for coming, and all our panelists will be getting a Safer Country mask, and we hope you'll stay safe out there. Once again, let me thank our board members, Boyd Walker, our president, and Vincent Smith, who joined us, who is our treasurer. Laura Mandela, I think, may be on the line. She's also on our vice president of our board. And so with that, I know we all want to go out and see what's happening on TV with the presidential debate. So that'll be it. Thank you very much, and have a great evening. Take care, all.